Hello everybody, and welcome to the Southwest Marine Ecosystems Marine and Coastal Birds webinar. This is looking back at noteworthy observations and research and breeding trends around the Southwest region in our avifauna last year in 2025. I'm Alex Banks, I'm the chair of the Birds Group of the Southwest Marine Ecosystems team. The Southwest Marine Ecosystems is a group of volunteers and professionals who come together to document changes in the marine ecosystem around the Southwest through a series of webinars, an annual face-to-face conference, and an annual report. We've got a great group of speakers today to tell us all about the research and some of the trends that we've been seeing around the Southwest, particularly last year. We expect the webinar to last about 2 hours. The chat function is not operational, but you should see a Q&A icon at the top of your screen. If you click on the Q&A, you should be able to ask a question and the speakers will be able to reply. We probably won't have time for verbal questions, so please share any thoughts, any questions, and in fact, any observations that you've made yourselves that are useful for us to know about in the Q&A. The webinar is being recorded and it will be shared through the Southwest Marine Ecosystems YouTube afterwards. So this is the region we're talking about, Southwest England. You can see the main seabird breeding colonies marked on the map here, all the way around from Dorset through Devon, the Isles of Scilly, Cornwall and Lundy in the north. Haven't got any data from Somerset this year, so we won't be talking much about Somerset. We will be talking about all of that blue area around the land, because we've got some speakers who are talking about research which has been happening at sea, as well as the nest monitoring that we do on land. So I'm going to hand over to our first speaker. It's Professor Tim Guilford from Oxford University. Tim is, I think it's fair to say, a pioneer in the UK and probably the world actually in bird tracking using miniaturized computers and GPS tags. And Tim's going to be telling us about some of the work he's been involved with recently around the Southwest. So I will hand over to you, Tim, or you should be able to take control of the slides, hopefully.
Thank you, Alex, for that very flattering introduction. Let me just... Okay, I think I've taken control. I need to move the slide forward. Yes. Well, good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. Can I just check that you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Tim.
Okay, good. I'm going to come to some work that we just started doing with you guys in the Southwest in a moment, but because that's very preliminary, I want to start by telling you a little bit about what my research group does. Mainly tracking shearwater, Manx shearwaters around the UK. We're kind of interested in three sorts of things. We're interested in behavioural mechanisms, such as how pelagic seabirds navigate and how they make decisions. We're interested in movement ecology and life history strategies generally, things like migration ecology and phenology. And we're interested in conservation science, the science that underpins the conservation for pelagic seabirds, that most threatened group of marine birds. We're interested in things like how shearwaters, we're interested in using tracking to see things like how shearwaters react to wind farms or to artificial light at night, or to provide evidence for the setting up of marine protected areas like the NACE's High Seas Marine Protected Area in the North Atlantic, or the current round of Spanish MPA expansions. And this is the kind of kit that we use for tracking shearwaters. On the bottom right, this is a solar-powered GSM downloading GPS logger attached to the back of a Manx shearwater. On the left is an archival snapshot post-processing GPS logger. This means it uses very, very little data and allows us to sort of really improve the performance of these devices, which are at the limit really of what we can still do tracking smaller seabirds. And these are great for answering questions about precise locations and movements during foraging. On the top right, this is an archival light logger, a geolocator, which also has an immersion logger in it. And this weighs a gram, and it attaches to a plastic ring on the bird's leg. And we use these to track migration. So I want to just give you three little snapshots really of things that we've done in recent years to give you an idea of how we've used this kit to answer questions about shearwaters. And I'm going to start with my former PhD student, Ollie Paget, friend, colleague, now at the University of Liverpool. And when he was doing his PhD, he wondered about these extraordinary trips, foraging trips that shearwaters make way out into the North Atlantic and then somehow navigate precisely back to their colonies. What kind of map are they using? How do they make these navigational decisions? So what Ollie did was to first algorithmically identify the likely start of the homing point, the decision to home, and then measure the orientation of the bird's movement as it moved towards home. And he compared that orientation to two possible things that might be going on. First, a direct grand circle route line back to the colony, the B line. That would be the most direct way back to the colony if there was no obstacle in the way. Or the shortest route over sea, which would take them around such an obstacle. Now, if the route back to the colony is uninterrupted, say by the island of Ireland, then those two things are the same. But very often they're not if they're foraging out to the west of Ireland or to the south of Cornwall, because there's an obstacle in the way if they take the B line. And this is what Ollie showed. I'm going to skip that slide. These two Rose diagrams on the left show first that the birds are very well oriented towards the colony when they start this homing journey way out at sea. But it turns out that the B line predicts their orientation better than does the shortest path. And what that means is that when they start heading home, they are following an orientation that will take them directly towards the colony, even if there is an obstacle in the way. And then when they reach the obstacle, they have to go round it. And what this shows, we think, is that the nature of the navigational map must be based on large-scale gradients, which allow the bird to pinpoint its position relative to the goal, but which does not encode topographical obstacles or objects. And on the right of those figures, you also see that Ollie managed to demonstrate that they don't just encode the direction to home, but also the distance. And this graph shows that they leave earlier in the day, they leave more hours for homing when they have further to get back to the colony at night. So when they're way out at sea, they leave much earlier in the day to give themselves time to get back to the colony. And they can only really do that if they also have some kind of estimate of distance. So the map encodes distance and direction to the colony, but it doesn't encode intervening obstacles. Now I want to show you some work by my outstanding postdoc Katrina Siddiqui Davis. She did this work when she was a PhD student with me. She's in the final year of a postdoc contract at the moment. So if anybody is looking for an outstanding young seabird biologist, then I recommend you snap her up. And on the left here, we see the extraordinary migration that Manx shearwaters make from their colonies around the UK, down to the Patagonian shelf of Argentina by a rather direct route, and then looping back through the Caribbean. These data are actually in the top left. These are actually from Lundy, but the pattern is pretty similar across many of the colonies. And then in the larger picture on the left, you see the core overwintering areas that each individual where each individual spends its winter. Now, what Trina did was to look at how these core overwintering areas are changing in response to climatic changes in the Southern Ocean. And she noticed this rather weird oscillating pattern that you see in that top graph. When she matched it up with the El Nino Southern Oscillation, she found a really rather beautiful match. So what's happening here is that in response to the oscillating climate in the Southern Ocean, shearwaters are moving north in bad years, the El Nino years, and south in La Nina, the good years, in this rather beautiful oscillating pattern. Because we tracked individual birds repeatedly across years, but also added new individuals to the study each year, Trina was able to separate out the effects of selection and individual flexibility. And what she found was that this effect was overwhelmingly being driven by individual responses to changing climate. Now, that's a really nice story because it suggests that this long-lived seabird is actually able individually to compensate for changing climate, at least to an extent. But it's not all good because El Nino years and La Nina years differ in their productivity in the Southern Ocean. And what Trina found, was that in poor years, in the following breeding season, 6 months later, a hemisphere away, now in the Northern Hemisphere, birds were showing fewer visits to feed their chick through the breeding season, and their chicks were achieving lower peak mass, a strong determinant of eventual fledging success and return to breed. So over a period of 6 months at least, and a hemisphere away, the effects of what's happening in the Southern Ocean are driving consequences for breeding in the north. And my final snapshot is just to tell you about a very short experiment I did some years ago, in which we noticed on a foggy night that shearwaters were crashing into the research building where the lights were normally left on and there were no curtains. That's now all changed, incidentally. The lights go off and there are curtains. We know that fledglings are attracted to and disoriented by artificial light at night, but on the whole, adult shearwaters are deterred by artificial light. Nevertheless, if you put artificial light and fog together, the shearwaters crash into the building. We found over a series of 2-minute on-off periods, when we switched the lights off and then back on again and counted the impacts with the roof, a 25-fold increase in adult collisions with the lit structure in fog. Now, you might say, well, they're disoriented by the fog, but of course they don't crash into the building when the lights are off, so they can see the building perfectly well in fog as long as there are no lights. Okay, now to the work that we have had the pleasure to be invited to come and do on Lundy and the Scilly Isles, and this is all very preliminary work. So just quickly, a week-long trip to Lundy this summer. Spectacular to come back 15 years after I was last on Lundy and tracking shearwaters, and to see what an amazing change has happened to this island as a seabird island. Absolutely phenomenal. In that week, we were able to deploy 10 GPS and 10 geolocators because there are these wonderful occupied nest boxes, which make it really easy to do these kinds of deployments. So we used archival GPS tags for this. We worked out of a tent, as you can see, and the sharp-eyed of you will notice that the picture of Lou Morris, who helped me throughout this, is from a different island altogether. No prizes for guessing where that is. And this is what we found. 9 GPS tracks from incubating, breeding shearwaters. Bit of a surprise, the birds all go to feed off the north coast of France and in the English Channel and off the south coast of England. Some of you might be wondering, what about that red track that disappears out of the north of the picture? Well, this is what happens if we zoom out. We see that this bird headed all the way up to, well, a latitude equivalent to the Faroe Isles, off the northwest of Scotland, then came and fed, and then came back down past the west coast of Ireland, down to France, and then back to Lundy. More about that in a moment. We can also classify the positions behaviorally using hidden Markov models, and this allows us to kind of isolate and plot likely foraging areas from commuting areas from resting. And this is just a plot of foraging positions and a kernel density estimate on the left side there as well. This shows the resting behavior. I'm not going to go into much detail there. Probably more interesting is to think about whether this is unusual. Well, we have 4 previous years of tracking data from Lundy, from 2009 to 2012, and you can see those lined up next to this year's tracking data. And it does look very different. In those earlier years, Lundy birds were generally going locally in the Celtic Sea or up to the Irish seafront to feed. Now it looks as if they're predominantly coming south into the English Channel and off the north coast of France. So, should we be surprised? Well, it turns out that this pattern seems to be fairly general. This on the left is all of our tracking data up to 2025. And what you can see is that two other of those colonies in light blue and in purple, that's Scoma and Skocum, are also, as it were, sending birds south now to the English Channel and northern France. And that's been happening in the last couple of years. But they're also going way out into the North Atlantic. And the one pattern that we have seen, I think, is that birds from these colonies are not particularly going further north or further south, but are going further altogether. So the extent of their foraging trips seems to have increased in recent years. So to Scilly now, where mainly we were looking at the prospects for monitoring and GPS tracking and just getting to know the place a bit. But we did manage to deploy just four remote download tracking devices on the little colony on Gu, which is just below the main gull colony. We did this by in the case of this one bird, this is a breeder, we caught this bird at its nest entrance as it was finishing feeding its chick. And what you can see here is the result of 10 days of tracking data, around about 10 foraging trips and returns to the colony in that time. Again, this bird is going both locally to the Scillies and south to the coast of France. If we drill down a little bit, you can see that there's quite a lot of rafting activity. That's those lovely curved lines as the bird sits on the water and drifts with the tide. But there's also some local foraging south and west of the Scillies. We also tracked 3 immatures. These we caught on the surface and identified as immatures because they didn't have a brood patch and they were behaving like immatures, shoving their noses down other people's burrows, for example. Again, we see this local activity to the colony, bit of foraging, bit of resting. But we also see this in red and green and blue, the red and green particularly, both going down to northern France and into the English Channel to feed. And then this extraordinary track in blue, where this immature bird goes way up into the Irish Sea and then comes round again through the Celtic Sea and up the west coast of Ireland before we, excuse me, before we lost transmission. So what's this bird doing? Well, what I've done here to finish is just to leave you with a puzzle. I've added on 5 other shearwater colonies, well, 6 and 7 if you include the 3 Pembrokeshire colonies under that one circle. This bird seems to be visiting other shearwater colonies. That wouldn't surprise you probably unless you think about the fact that shearwaters are extremely natally philopatric, which means that this bird is almost certainly going to breed on the island where it was born. So what's it doing visiting these other colonies? I think that's me finished. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. That was fascinating as ever. I think every time I see a seabird tracking presentation, it's just mind-blowing how much individual variation there is, which I guess shouldn't be a surprise, but sometimes we think colonies act as, you know, microorganisms almost, but they're very, very different behaviors, aren't they? Yeah, the animals within them. That's fantastic. Thank you. We're going to pass on now to Sabia Sheikh, who is a doctoral candidate at the University of Exeter. Sabia has also been doing some seabird tracking work and is going to tell us about her research. Can you take control, Sabia?
Yes. Okay.
Great. Over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so good evening, everyone. I'm Sabya, and today I'm going to be talking to you about some of the seabird tracking work that I've been doing in the Isles of Scilly. Um, so I'll start by giving a bit of background. Seabirds play an important ecological role in the ecosystems that they inhabit. They're ecosystem engineers and excellent indicators of marine ecosystem health. But globally, half of seabird populations are declining, which makes them one of the most threatened groups of birds. And in Europe, fisheries and climate-induced changes in prey availability has been identified as a major threat to seabird populations. Seabirds are very challenging to protect due to their highly mobile nature. So understanding seabird and forage fish interactions is quite important to establish effective spatial protection. So my field site is the Isles of Scilly, which is an oceanic archipelago. It's also a designated special protection area and encompasses 26 sites of special scientific interest and supports an internationally important assemblage of 13 seabird species. And all of these seabirds are features of the special protection area as well as the sites of special scientific interest. So for my work, I focus on three species. Two of them are of conservation concern because of their declining populations on the Isles of Scilly. So the first one is the European shag that has declined by 61% in the last 25 years. And then the lesser black-backed gull that has declined by 72.5%. And then I've got the razorbills that have increased by 170%, because it's important to know what's going right as well. And through my research, I want to explore whether food availability plays a role in the declines of these two populations here on the left. So, to be able to understand whether food availability plays a role in population declines, we need to answer three key questions. Where are seabirds foraging? What are they foraging on? And how much of what they're foraging on is available within their foraging grounds? Um, so to do this, I have been GPS tagging all three species. So how my research works is I put a tag on each of these species, individuals of each of these species, and then these GPS tags collect um, GPS locations of where the birds have been. And then this data is transmitted from the tags via a mobile phone network to my laptop or an online system. So for European shags in 2025, we GPS tagged 15 breeding individuals. These were caught on their nest by hand or using a leg hook. The number of days each bird was tracked ranged from 6 to 38 days. And this gave me a data set of 321 foraging trips. So I thought I'll show my map from 2024 as well as my map from 2025 just to see how the data is across the years. And from data from both of these years, it looks like that shags forage primarily within the Isles of Scilly archipelago. Um, so on average, the total distance that they travel during a foraging trip is 12.2 kilometers, and the maximum distance that they travel away from their colony is 3.5 kilometers. Right. And then moving on to my second species, the lesser black-backed gulls. So in 2025, we tagged 18 lesser black-backed gulls. And the number of days that we tracked individuals ranged from 7 to 50 days. And this gave me a data set of 932 foraging trips. And then again, I've shown, so the map on the left is from 2024 and the map on the right is from 2025. And it seems like they are foraging primarily offshore and they seem to be going west and southwest of the islands. The black triangle represents the breeding location. So on average, lesser black-backed gulls traveled 67 kilometers during the foraging trips, and 34 0.5 kilometers away from their colony. So the total distance of the foraging round trip was, or the average total distance of the foraging round trip was 64 kilometers. And the maximum distance away from their colony was 34. And then I've got some data from razorbills. So we tagged 4 razorbills in 2025, and the number of days tracked ranged from 4 to 6 days. And we got a data set of 34 foraging trips. So this is the first year that we've tracked razorbills. And here is a map of the tracking data from all those tags. So on average, razorbills were traveling 24 kilometers during a foraging trip. And they seem to be doing a combination of shorter and longer foraging trips during chick shearing period. So now the second question that I'm asking is, what are they foraging on? And for this, we are using a multi-method approach. So we are examining regurgitate from shags whenever they regurgitate when we tag them, but we've also been collecting pellets that lesser black-backed gulls regurgitate and examining the remains of those pellets. And then I've also been collecting guano samples, and they are being processed by our collaborator to extract and sequence the DNA of prey items from the guano. And today I'm only going to be presenting results from the DNA metabarcoding of guano samples. So here is the results from the shag guano samples from 2024, because my 2025 samples are still being processed. So from these results, it seems like that shags predominantly forage on fish from the sand eel family and fish from the Clupidae family, which could either be sprat or Atlantic herring, but they're really hard to genetically tell apart, which is why we only classify this to the family level. And then 2% of their diet also included ballan wrasse. In contrast, lesser black-backed gulls were foraging on a diverse range of species that included European pilchard, boarfish, poorcod, sand eel, fish from the sea robin family, tadpole fish, and fish from the right-eye flounder family, and blue whiting. So some of these species that are present in the diet of lesser black-backed gulls indicate the use of fisheries discards. Now, to answer the third question of how much prey is available, we've been conducting baited remote underwater video system surveys. So this involves putting 2 GoPros on a frame and submerging that underwater with a little baited canister for an hour. And through this, we can record information about the habitat and fish, and this is the kind of data that it gives us. So this is a shoal of sand eels passing through. Once we have this data, we identify the species of the fish that we see. We estimate the relative abundance of the different forage fish species that we see, record the habitat, and record the distribution of the fish species. And this map sort of shows you the kind of data that we get for forage fish. Now, using all of this data that I have, the next steps are to look at foraging habitat selection of seabirds in relation to prey availability, and hopefully contribute towards a more data-driven approach to SPA management. And that's me done. Thank you.
Thanks, Sabir. What a great project, true ecosystem study, having the prey availability and the bird movement stuff. I mean, that's a fantastic data set you've got, and it's looking really good. Please add your questions into the Q&A for either Sabir or Tim, but thank you both very much for those really interesting and thought-provoking presentations.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to now move to, we're going to stay with the Isles of Scilly actually, And we're going to hear from Hester Odgers, who's with the Isles of Scilly Wildlife Trust, about the breeding season in 2025. Are you there, Hester?
Yeah.
Over to you. Assuming you can take control.
Can I take control? Where's my, control. Yes, I can confirm I have control. Thank you.
Over to you then.
Hi everyone. My name's Hester. I am the Seabird officer at the Isles of Scilly Wildlife Trust, and I'm just going to give you all an update on the results of last year's breeding seabird survey. So we're sort of leaving the realm of fascinating academic research, and we're going more into monitoring. So this will be a bit less conceptually complex and a bit more. There were more of these this year, and there were less of these this year. So in general this year, last summer, I should say, it was quite a positive season for a lot of our species, with some major exceptions that we'll get into later. But it was really good to see increases in some of our species, including shags and Manx shearwaters, and populations of other birds that have recently been in serious decline, holding quite steady. The results from the survey were broadly quite encouraging last summer. And another highlight of the summer was the really cool collaboration work we were doing with Sabia, with Tim, with various other people. So it was a real pleasure working with all these interesting researchers who are helping us answer more questions about our birds than we can. So digging into our individual species a bit, just for context, we do a big all islands, all species survey every 6 or 7 years. We can't do it annually because the resources and time commitment is far too high. So this year wasn't one of the big all islands years. We were just monitoring a few sample sites, mostly on the island of Annet. That's our sample site for most of our species. It's our second biggest uninhabited island, and it is rat-free and has been for a long time. So it's kind of our major seabird site. So shags, as Sabia mentioned, have been really suffering on Scilly for a long time. But this season was actually quite a good year. It was our highest population of shags on Annet since 2011, up to 113 pairs, showing a continued recovery since the low point of 53 pairs that we had in 2023. It was quite a noticeable increase, actually. Everyone who did field work on Annet mentioned that they felt like there were more of them around. So it's good to see that was confirmed by the numbers. Moving to a much less happy story, fulmars are probably doing the worst. We're doing the worst of all our bird species last summer. I know that's they're experiencing declines on quite a wide scale around the country, but they are really, really dropping off here. So Annet, we had our lowest population on record. Fulmars, we also monitor their productivity at another couple of sites called Menawethan and the Daymark. Those are the two graphs on the right-hand side. We've got productivity on the top, population on the bottom. As you can see, they both went down since last year. And we actually had a shockingly low productivity on Menawethan last summer, where only one chick from 29 pairs was observed to fledge. So they are clearly not doing very well. Not sure why that is. We will see what they're doing this summer. To bring us all back up a bit after that, we've got the Manx shearwaters. So we don't try and survey Manx shearwaters and Annet just because the scale of the island makes that really hard. But we do annually survey their population on St Agnes and Gew, and we have done that ever since before the rat removal project in the winter of 2013-2014. So if you look at the graph on the left here, you can see it was quite a low, consistent population prior to that, to the 2013-14 rat removal project. And after that, we've seen fairly sustained growth since then. There's now 225 Manx shearwaters across both islands, which is a record high, really good to see. And these are some of the birds that Tim managed to track last summer, which was also just incredibly exciting. Knowing where they're going is just thrilling. But most of the growth now seems to be occurring on Gew, possibly because there's restricted habitat on St Agnes because we've got grazing cattle. I think possibly that was actually a suggestion by Tim to me last summer. So if so, I'm sorry for stealing that and not attributing it, Tim, but thank you for the thought. More broadly, between 2015 and 2023, Manx shearwaters increased by over 100% across the archipelago, and that does largely seem to be driven by the rat-free sites. So it's just an indication of what happens when you remove rats, as I'm sure we'll hear about from Lundy later on. Storm petrels, another species that's obviously massively impacted by rats. The main site that we monitor storm petrels on every summer is Round Island. It's a small island. It's generally rat-free, although we have had incursions in the last few years. And it's got one of our major storm petrel colonies on it. It's also a more manageable size to monitor, unlike some of the sort of massive boulder beaches where our storm petrels nest. So this is our normal monitoring site. If you look at the numbers in the table in the middle, it was quite low numbers this year. But in a broader context, it's more than last winter. So you can see in 2022 and 2024, the numbers are massively lower than in the years before. We think that's reflective of rat incursion occurring within the breeding season at some point. So the drop from 172 nests to 11 from 2015 to 2022, we think we had rats there prior to the 2022 breeding season. And then the drop from 105 in 2023 to just 17 in 2024. Again, we think rats made it there. Oh, well, we know rats made it there. We carried out an incursion response, and we're hopeful that the slight increase or the slight recovery to 2025 means that we did successfully clear the rats. We think they would have kept declining, possibly abandoned the site completely if there were still rats present. So it was good to see a bit of recovery. We don't know what's been happening there this winter. We wanted to go and do a check for rats, see if they'd made it back again, but the weather has just been so abysmal, and it's a hard island to land on that there was no way we could get there. So fingers crossed for the breeding season. We'll get on there and check it as soon as we can, but hopefully rats haven't made it back and we will see a continued increase in the storm petrel population. Lesser black-backed gulls. I decided to focus on the Gew colony of lesser black-backed gulls. So that's the colony that Sabia was working in a lot this summer as well. The population on Annet, our other sample site, tends to be consistently quite low, between 1 and 20 pairs, varying year to year. So it doesn't tell us very much about the populations. As Sabia mentioned, lesser black-backed gulls have really, really declined in recent years, over a 70% loss since 2000. And that's largely been driven by the collapse of several major colonies. We used to have 3 big lesser black-backed gull colonies on 3 different islands. Gew is now the only one remaining. But on the positive side, as you can see from this graph, it's been pretty consistent. It seems to be doing well, holding strong in the face of the collapse of the other colonies. We don't know why that is, but obviously we're thrilled to see it. This summer we had, or last summer we had 491 pairs counted, which is the highest we've had on record for a while, and represents a slight increase. So that's all really encouraging. And again, thanks to Sabia for being able to tell us more about where these birds are going when they get outside the land. It's really, really cool to see that. Herring gulls, again, I haven't bothered to show you the results from Annet, our main sample site, because it's a small number of individuals fluctuating again between about 5 and 20 pairs year on year. It doesn't tell us very much. Herring gulls are also declining around the archipelago. They dropped by 40% between 2015 and 2023. We don't have any major colonies of herring gulls. They're much more dispersed around the islands, but we do monitor the urban colony of herring gulls. So we have 20 odd herring gull pairs nesting on the roofs in Hewtown, and we're able to access them and monitor their productivity every summer. So they've been pretty consistent, as you can see on the graph on the right-hand side. This summer was no different. It seems maybe that they've just occupied all of the available rooftop habitat. My colleague Vicky, who has been doing this job for longer than I have, basically just knows where every nest is, and we go around every summer, check for new ones, but it's generally just the same pairs in the same places, and they seem to be doing all right. No great loss among them. Great black-backed gulls, again, they are declining on Scilly. all our gulls are struggling. They've dropped 38% between 2015 and 2023, which is obviously a bit worrying. But Annet, our main sample site for these species, has been experiencing recent declines. As you can see from the graph, it dropped from 2020 through to 2023 and 2024. But thankfully, it remained stable between last summer and the summer before. So the colony on Annet has at least not declined again last summer. It did seem, perhaps just based on personal experience, like birds were moving out of the main colony on one end of the island and becoming more dispersed along the coastline. Not sure why that is. I'm hoping to start mapping the nests properly so that we can actually see if that's a pattern that's happening, because that would be interesting. And our final gull species also doing terribly, because they all are our kittiwakes. Kittiwakes have really collapsed on Scilly. They're down 72% or more than 72% since 2015. We used to have several subcolonies across the archipelago. Now they're just restricted to a small population on Gew. Technically, last summer was the largest that colony's been since 2018, but that's still only 32 nests. So it's obviously not really a viable colony. We also only saw 3 fledglings last summer as compared to 14 last year. So what we'll see this year, I don't know, but I'll be going out to put cameras out on them pretty soon. Moving on to the one that all the tourists care about, so I suppose this is economically the most significant. Puffins, they're the only auks that we monitor annually, just because some of the logistical challenges in monitoring our razorbills and guillemots have meant that we haven't done that so far on our annual surveys. But our puffins have basically been pretty consistent population-wise for a long time, enough to keep the tourists happy. We don't have a massive population, but they have been fairly stable. As you can see, the Annet population has fluctuated a little bit, dropped a bit since 2021, but has generally remained fairly stable. I'm a little worried about what we'll see this summer, but we'll get into that in a moment. Common terns. We used to have quite a healthy population of common terns way back when, but in recent years they've been inconsistent in their nesting efforts. We only really get them on Annet now, and they don't nest every year. They did breed this summer, and they also bred earlier in the season than they did last summer, which was great to see. So we had 18 nests, obviously not a massive colony, but still an improvement on the year before. And unlike in 2024, they actually nested early enough in the season that they got some chicks away. I think Sabia recently slightly took the mick out of me for the fact that our data set in one of our reports said that they'd had at least 11 fledglings, which, as she pointed out, is not very scientific and not very helpful for modelling. But it was based on anecdotal data from our local boatmen. Scilly's a big site. We don't get everywhere, so we do rely on reports from trusted locals. So there were at least 11 fledglings. Sorry, I can't be more detailed than that, Savia. So that was last summer, generally quite positive, or at least neutral, but with a couple of major exceptions. Looking ahead to 2026, we've had a lot of puffins washing up recently on Scilly. I know that's been happening around a lot of the coastline, and there's big signs of a seabird wreck going on. But we've had a lot of puffins washing up. We don't know if they are birds that breed on Scilly. We don't know if they're maybe from Iceland. So who knows what the effect on our breeding puffin population will be. I'm also curious / concerned to see what the effect will be on shags, because I know they generally forage in the archipelago, as Sabia said, and we've had horrendous weather recently, so I'm not sure how successful they will have been at foraging. So possibly it's that positive news from last summer on Annet will not be continued for next year in terms of our shag population, but fingers crossed. Another concern for 2026 is that we have had some issues with cat predation of storm petrels and also Manx shearwaters on St Agnes. We had several storm petrels that looked like they'd been predated by a cat, and also one young Manx shearwater. So we are trying to take steps to address that this summer, but it's an ongoing concern. Biosecurity, always a concern on Scilly, as in any seabird island. Round Island, I've already mentioned. We don't know if the rats are back. We hope they aren't, but we need to go and check. We'll be doing our ongoing checks on St Agnes and Gew, and we will be checking on Annet to make sure rats haven't got back. HPAI, we've always gotten away reasonably well on Scilly, possibly because our colonies are so dispersed and not really dense. We've not had massive impacts from bird flu in the past, although we had a lot of gannets washing up in 2022. So I'm hoping that continues and that we don't see any outbreaks among our colonies. On the more positive side, we're looking to develop and expand our monitoring program. So we've got some exciting potential projects coming up in the next few years. And we're trying to use this year as a development year to trial out new monitoring strategies, increase the sample of things that we manage to get to every year, and collect better quality information on a wider number of species, really. I think that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hester. Good news and bad news, as usual. Before you go, just on that, are you still there? On the wreck question, I just wondered whether had any of the birds that had been recovered on Scilly had rings at all or not?
I think I saw a report on the wildlife chat of a ringed bird. I wasn't on Scilly at the time, so I'm not sure myself. If it was, it would have been reported in because a lot of the people on that chat know their ringing. So I have a vague memory of a ringed bird, but I can't confirm.
Okay, but yeah, it'd been interesting to know where that was from. As you say, we'll see what the effects might be in 2026. But thank you, that was a great roundup. Okay. We are now going to move to the mainland, and I'm going to hand over to Mark Grantham and Ryan Irvin to tell us about what's been happening in Cornwall. Mark, are you going to go first?
Yep, I can do. Super. I was going to say, people just talking about your puffin question, Alex, that a lot of the ringed birds that have been reported to the BTO are birds that have puffin ringing is really sort of restricted to sort of single islands, so it's really difficult to know how the wider population's impacted. So they've all come from like Treshnish and Salisbury, where there's like intensive ringing efforts. So away from those sites, sadly, we don't really know much about puffin recoveries. But there we go.
Interesting. Thanks.
But anyway, back to Cornwall. So I'm Mark Grantham from Cornwall Birds, which is the county bird club in Cornwall. We kind of do something a bit different, I think, to everyone else. So there's quite a focus on breeding seabirds really for a lot of the presentations, and that's probably quite right. But from a Cornwall context as well, you know, we're blessed with some breeding seabirds, which is great. But we're also blessed with, you know, fantastic sea watching opportunities. So generally in these sessions, we kind of just highlight some of the sort of the peak counts of some of the scarcer seabirds, and basically just look at how these things might be changing. So just looking back at some of the sea watching totals from 2025, and starting off with the big shearwaters, you know, and we've spoken a bit more at length about these over the last couple of Southwest Marine Ecosystems webinars about what might be driving the increases of these big shearwaters into southwest waters. And these generally seem to be impacts in breeding areas, especially for something like Corrie's shearwater, that is really sort of beyond our control. But what happens in some of these other breeding sites really drives birds further north into sort of foraging off Cornish waters. So yeah, you know, even something like Corrie's shearwaters, counts of 1,300 and 1,400 birds in a day, you know, would be unheard of, you know, perhaps 15, 20 years ago. But then, you know, the bigger news is Great Shearwater, which, you know, even 1,000 birds would have been exceptional 5 or 10 years ago, perhaps. And then last year, you know, we had an absolutely unprecedented count of 53,000 birds passing Southerly Point at Lizard in early September, you know, and that's an incredible number, and we've just not seen anything like that historically, or even in the sort of the big influx years in recent years. Scopolis shearwater, you know, only 2 records during the year, which is perhaps slightly surprising because it kind of bucked the ever upwards trend of that species. But again, with not many other Corys shearwaters, perhaps as a carrier species, then we're not seeing those. Balearic shearwater, although I think now we should be calling it Mediterranean shearwater. I think that under the there's been quite a lot of taxonomic shake-ups in world bird taxonomy, and there's a new unified bird list which is called AviList, and that now treats Balearic shearwater, or what was Balearic shearwater, now as Mediterranean shearwater. So I guess at some point, Alex, we probably need to decide how we're going to refer to these birds in presentations, because whether we call them, we know a lot about Balearic shearwaters, and it's like, well, now we call them Mediterranean shearwaters. Do we lose a bit of sort of clarity on what those birds might be? But there we go, something to discuss down the line. And then another species that's been increasing, I think Scott Reed talked about this last year, is Wilson's petrel. You know, and that record of 66 reports in 2025 was exceptional, including, you know, 19 off one site on one day is unheard of from the mainland. You know, those are small numbers if you look at sort of Scott's pelagic trips and things like that off the Scillies, but from a mainland site, those are quite exceptional. And then, yeah, obviously, while there are people out there sea watching, and it's always hard with sea watching numbers that, you know, I think there's more interest in sea watching now, so more people are out there, so we have better coverage, so you might expect these counts to be increasing anyway. But big numbers of grey phalaropes, you know, again, this is quite a recent phenomenon, and an exceptional count, you know, yet again, another exceptional count of Sabine's gull off Pendeen on the west coast of Penwith. Some of the sort of rarer, rather than just the scarce, some of the rarer species recorded during the year. Barolo shearwater used to be called little shearwater many years ago. 3 records of Barolo shearwater, all off Pendeen. You know, and it's these same sea watching sites that you kind of see cropping up. And bear in mind, these are only reports of birds, that some of these probably have yet to be accepted by the relevant rarities committees, but that can take time. So these won't have all been sort of officially made it into the county record yet. But then species like Banrunt petrel, the soft plumage petrel, Thayer's petrel kind of group always causes a bit of confusion. It's quite difficult to understand over time how the records are increasing for those species, because their taxonomy is quite complex, and probably only in recent years, with the advent of better digital photography, have we been able to identify to species level some of these soft plumage petrel, Thayer's petrel, Xeno petrel type birds that have been seen off the coast. And then just to finish off with, yeah, a nice kind of couple of records of albatross as well. Highlight of anyone's sea watch, I'm sure. So coming kind of closer inshore, we don't report on things like divers and grebes and things like that every year, but interestingly, last year we did report on divers. So we just looked at some random figures for divers over 2009, 21, 22, 23 and 24, and these are red-throated diver in red, black-throated diver in black, and great northern diver in grey. And the bars that are marked there, the black and the grey, are the nationally significant numbers for those species. And interestingly, those sort of populations or those numbers had dropped off. But then during 2025, for 2 of those key species, red-throated diver and great northern diver, we saw big counts. And I was chatting to Ryan recently, and yeah, there have been some further big counts of red-throated diver and black-throated diver this winter, which we'll then be reporting on at this time next year, I suppose. So going on to just some of the trends for some of our breeding seabirds. So cormorants appeared to have quite a poor year. So our two key sites here in the county are Mullion Island and Lew Island. And really they kind of, the numbers, you know, kind of, yeah, but vaguely track each other. We've seen similar sort of increases over time at both sites, but then we had reasonable numbers last year, but then sorry, in 2024, then 2025 we saw big declines at both Mullion and Lew Island. So not quite sure what that what the cause of that might be. And unfortunately, looking at Mullion Island just over the weekend, the count there of around 60 apparently occupied nests on Mullion Island 2025, we only counted 47 at the weekend. So it may be there's been further declines on Mullion as well. But we never know a final number until we go onto the island to ring black-backed gull chicks, because quite often cormorants will nest out of sight of the mainland. So these are all sites that are photographed from the mainland. For great black-backed gull, probably contrary to what's happening on the Scillies, our great black-backed gulls have remained stable, if not increased slightly. We still seem to have an issue with productivity at both of these sites. So unfortunately, we didn't get a proper count of black-backed gulls on Mullion in 2025, and that was purely because where the cormorants were nesting on the island, they'd moved, and we couldn't safely get around the island to count black-backed gull nests without risking pushing any cormorant chicks sort of towards cliff edges. So we got as far as standing on top of the island and having a look and deciding we couldn't go any further, and had to back off. So sadly, we don't know much about blackbacks on Mullion this year in 2025. Kittiwakes, the woeful tale continues really, with you know, yet further lack of success around the various sites. So we are down really to just the 3 sites now. So that's Portreath and the area that runs Rinsey to Porthleven along the south coast, and then the site at Porthmisson, which is up near Weybridge on the north coast. And if we look at the actual sites that we have, so, and although there are reasonable numbers at some of these sites, the numbers of birds that are fledging remains desperately poor. So Porthmisson 283 occupied sites and 168 fledged chicks, and these are sites that always suffer from predation of some sort, whether it's raven or crow or peregrine taking chicks. So very low productivity. And I'll just skip on to the next slide just briefly. So if people haven't seen these presentations before, this is the movement of kittiwakes from Rinsey to Trewalvers to Porthleven. These are some of the sites that I'm obviously just mentioning. So before 2012, birds were all in the zone at Rinsey. Roll forward a few years and they moved to Trewalvers Head. Roll forward a few more years and they've moved to Trequeen. And now majority of the birds are in what we call Craggy Zorn or Park Trammel Cove. And you can see here that there are now fewer than 10 birds at Trewalvers and Rinsey, and over 140 at Park Trammel. But again, these are sites that are quite hard to monitor. So a lot of the time our productivity estimates are quite small. And if I just zip along to Craggy Zorn, there you go. I had to include Cove, and you can see here that this is a site that you can't really view from the coast path, so you can kind of see probably the top third of the colony from the coast path if you're lucky. So the only way to access it really is via kayak. So and this is unfortunate because we've had a long-running project where we were colouring birds at Treworvis, and now they've moved down to Craggy Zorn. It's actually quite difficult to read rings. And if I just play the video again, you can see that we access it by kayak, and then trying to look up and see legs on some of these higher nesting birds to read colourings is rather difficult. And you can see that access is always going to be difficult, that we can only access the site on a sort of a mid or a low tide when there's no swell. So there isn't really any other way to properly monitor this site apart from by kayak. So last year we had 13 birds that we'd colour-ringed in previous years, the oldest being one ringed 10 years previously at Treworvis. And then in amongst those birds are 6 French ringed birds, which now breed with us, the oldest being a chick ringed in 2013 in France. You can see where these French sites are, and we'll just look at one of these birds that was at Craggy Zorn in 2025. So VT is actually a bird that we ringed as a chick at Treworvis Head 2017. It then moved as a become a regular bird, possibly not a breeding bird, down to Trequeen in 2020, and then moved over to France. And you can see on the map there where the two key colonies are in France, Pont-de-Vanne and Pont-de-Raz. And it bred at those sites in both 2021 and 2022, and then was back in Cornwall, regular at Craggy Zorn in 2025. And I would imagine that by saying a bird is regular is that we think that will be a breeding bird, but it's never quite clear because we have limited time in the colony and visibility is always difficult. So I mean, that's just my very quick summary of where we're at in the year, and we kind of I try to look ahead and guide people into how they can contribute to some of the work that we're doing. And I think really there are two key ways that people can support some of the monitoring work. They're both quite easy ways, really, but one of the obvious ways, which probably takes more time than effort, is just needing more information on these quite easy to monitor species. So it's very easy at a lot of sites, Swanpool in Falmouth and places like that. You can sit on a rock, within a stone's throw of a bar selling you beer, and you can monitor things like fulmar. And these are birds that we really don't get enough records of, with accurate productivity monitoring of these birds. So if you know of a site where you regularly see shag or fulmar or herring gull even, then these are all sites that are well worth monitoring. If you need any advice on monitoring, do get in touch with one of us, and we can sort of guide you through the best way to monitor these sites and get the most out of your efforts. And the other thing as well that nobody's really mentioned yet is colour ringing. And quite a lot of our understanding of what our birds are doing, particularly longer term. So while something like tracking will tell you quite a lot about what birds are doing and the movements of birds, things like colour ringing over longer periods of time will really start to tell you about survival rates and things like that. One of those key sort of drivers of population change is adult survival rates. So looking at generating resightings of these colouring birds is hugely important. So we have a big project running on herring gulls in Cornwall and on Isles of Scilly. We ring a lot of lesser blackbacks on the Isles of Scilly. We also ring, so those both have blue rings with white letters. Great blackback gulls we ring in Cornwall, Isles of Scilly, and those are birds that have a white ring with red letters. And in the past, not so much now because we can't access nest sites, but we have ringed kittiwakes in the past. A bit more difficult to read those though. And then the last two species are shag and cormorant. So our shags we're ringing on the Isles of Scilly, and that's giving us some really interesting information on where these birds are moving, particularly in relation to into storms. And we've had very strange movements of birds up into the Bristol Channel as far north as Gloucestershire from the Scillies in response to stormy weather. And then in the past, we've ringed cormorants on Mullion Island, and there's still some of those birds around, so always worth keeping an eye out for those with their orange rings. So basically just some pretty pictures to kind of encourage you to keep an eye out for colouring birds. So this is a Danish black-headed gull at the exotic location of Helston Boating Lake. So this is one of our Mullion Island cormorants on the left, actually recorded in Somerset a few years ago, and intriguingly is sat next to a bird that was ringed in the Netherlands. So we think that our breeding birds are of the subspecies Carbo, but it's sat next to a Dutch bird which we think are sinensis. And interestingly, I've been looking recently at some of my photos of some of the mullion birds, and I think it's not clear really what subspecies our birds will be, although you would absolutely imagine they'd be Carbo. This is one of the French ring kittiwakes. So our kittiwakes would have a single black ring with a code on it, but the French will use multiple rings. So this is red over orange over metal on the left leg and green over yellow over orange on the right. And that will identify that as an individual ringed as a chick. If you're out on the beach, peer out. So I was at Coverack earlier in the winter looking for any ringed birds that I could see. So, and I saw one of these great blackback gulls with a green ring, which is actually a bird ringed in France. And as I got my camera out, I realized it was stood next to another great blackback gull with a green ring, also ringed in France. So, and that was just on the beach at Coverack. So, you know, you don't have to go anywhere exotic to find these colour ringed birds. And then it definitely doesn't get less exotic than Prince of Wales Pier in Falmouth, but we have a very large urban population of herring gulls that are ringed, both at places like Newquay and St Ives and Falmouth. So always worth keeping an eye out for those. And if you're on the beach, you might also see Mediterranean gulls, and they can have a variety of rings. So we have birds in Cornish estuaries on a regular basis from France, from Belgium, from the Netherlands, from the Czech Republic, from Hungary. So always worth keeping an eye out on your med gull flocks and keeping an eye out for ringed birds. And again, if you don't know where to report them, give us a shout. And last but not least, I had to include a Scilly lesser blackback gull, because these are what are keeping me occupied at the moment, because all these Scilly ringed lesser blackback gulls are all in exotic places like Morocco and Portugal and Spain at the moment. So plenty of resightings of those, but they're coming back. They'll be back coming through our estuaries soon. So worth keeping an eye out for. Cool. That's all from me.
Right, thanks, Mark. I'll take over. Good evening. I'm Ryan Irvin. I work for Goby Consultants, and I'm just going to talk a bit about guillemot and razorbills in Cornwall, the breeding season over the last year or two. So just to give you a quick overview of guillemot and razorbill, they are actually bucking the seabird trends, really. They're increasing significantly in England. If you look at using the data from the Seabirds count book, guillemot have increased by 105% in England since 2000, and the Cornish population since 2000 has actually increased by a whopping 323%. And the Cornish population is now 3.1% of the English population. This is up from 1.5% in 2000. So it's a good news story for Cornwall and England. And it's the same with razorbill, you know, 240% increase in 2000 for England, and the Cornish population, a similar increase to the guillemot with 331%. And the Cornish population, as it says there, is 5.3% of the English population, up, not as large an increase, but it's still up from 4.2% in 2000. So looking at Cornwall, the coverage is pretty sparse. There's some colonies that have only had one or two colony counts, generally because they're really hard to count, they're really inaccessible. But I have looked at myself several colonies in the last 2 years, and I've got data for 12 sites. The map there shows they're quite dotted, or quite wide range of the coastline in Cornwall there. So it gives you a general overview of what's happening. 9 of these sites are situated within a triple SI, but Guillemot and Razorbill are not a feature in any of the triple SI. So there's no real protection or management for Guillemot and Razorbill at these triple SIs. So apologies for the graphs. They're not particularly easy to read, but I kind of put them in just because they kind of show what's happening. The general overall trend is the same as in the countrywide trend, that they're all increasing, or most of them are increasing. So 8 out of the 12 sites are increasing, 3 are stable, maybe generally slightly increasing, with only 1 decreasing, or actually I think the colony is now being abandoned, but it was a small colony. The top graph, I had to split the colonies up for Guillemot because the top graph shows the Arm Knight and the sisters, which have increased exponentially in the last 10 years. Razorbill has a similar trend, not quite as large increases for Guillemot, but 6 of the sites are increasing, 5 are stable, with only 1 declining. But again, the declining colony was a very small colony. So these birds have probably just moved to one of the other colonies. So is it all good news? Well, does the population increase tell the full story? From the results that we've found in the last 2 years, we don't think so. The productivity for guillemots in the 12 sites range from 0.01 to 0.31, and for Razorbill, slightly better, but not much, 0.06 to 0.37 per pair. Now, when you compare that to the national average, it is less than half. And actually, when you look at the southwest average, or the south stroke west coast averages, it's even worse. So although we're seeing these population increases in Cornwall, it doesn't actually look so good once you start looking at the productivity. So, and I should add that the recorded productivity that I've put there for the 12 sites is probably an overestimate. We didn't record 1 single jumpling actually in the sea. So we may have missed some in between visits, but the likelihood is that the productivity for every site is nearer 0. So I'll just finish with a few unanswered questions, and maybe some people have the answers, or maybe just for questions for people to go away with and have a think about. So why is productivity so low? Predation, I have witnessed predation, corvid predation, gull predation, peregrine predation, but also it would be interesting to know if there's any mammal predation, which a bit harder to prove, probably needs some nocturnal visits and things like that. Is lack of food a problem? That's a far more difficult question to answer. And then disturbance. So there is a lot of recreational activities happening in the Cornish coast. It's a great coast to go rock climbing, coasteering, paddleboarding, kayaking, and they all, in certain colonies, these will have impacts and have been causing some disturbance. So are these also causing the productivity to be low? So the question I find most baffling is, why are colonies increasing in size when productivity is so low? Generally, when you look at seabird colonies, when productivity is low, they kind of abandon colonies. So this seems to be kind of doing the exact opposite. These colonies are increasing, but the productivity is very, very poor. So is this a recent development? Is this just happened in the last 2, 3, maybe 4 years? So if it is a recent development, what will the colonies look like in 10 years? You know, once we feel the full impact of a poor productivity period, when the adult birds start to die off or something like that, will the colonies disappear from Cornwall, or will they? Yeah, I think that's my last question. Will we end up seeing that all these colonies end up disappearing in 10, 20 years' time because the productivity is so low? And that's me finished, Alex.
Thanks very much, Ryan. That's just fascinating. And I think, as you say, those colonies are not well monitored. I can't recall us ever talking about productivity in those colonies on this call or on this webinar before. So it's great that that's kind of being brought to light, because I think, as you say, there is a sort of temptation to assume everything's doing okay when we see abundance increases like of the scale that we've been seeing, but clearly all is not well. So yeah, thank you very much. That's lots to think about there. It sounds like a big research project needed. Okay, right, we're now going to take a break from breeding reports to hear from Professor Tom Brereton. Tom is with the charity MARINElife and spends a lot of his time at sea, and he's going to tell us about what he's been seeing last year. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Alex, and good evening, everybody. Yes, I'm going to talk about MARINElife's at-sea surveys from 2025, that the bulk of those surveys of which have been done by volunteers. And yeah, that's one of the highlights in the middle of the picture, if you hadn't spotted it yet, a Caspian gull amongst 700 other species there. So last year we had a number of at-sea survey programs underway, which are shown on this map. So we've got 5 ferry routes. These are sort of mostly year-round monthly surveys going, you know, the Lundy ferries, for example, and a couple across to the Channel Isles, as well as the Scilly's ferry. Then perhaps the most interesting program is the partnership survey with Cefas on the Celtic research cruise. That's all those yellow transit lines. That runs for a month every October, and we've been doing that since 2013 every year. We've also got a couple of small boat projects on the go, focused on Lyme Bay, which are the brown lines there, and then a new project we started in 2025 at Falmouth Bay in Cornwall. Nobody's mentioned it too much yet, but we're certainly having lots of problems with the weather trying to get surveys done. We lost 25 hours on the Cefas Celtic survey due to the poor weather, and my small boat trips from Brixham, 5 of the 6 were cancelled, and it wasn't much better the last couple of years actually. And also the Scilly's ferry has been quite challenging to run as well. We've had 3 of the 8 cancelled last year. Okay, this just summarises the survey effort. So across all the routes, about 7,000 kilometres of track line sampled at sea. And you can see for each route there is a lot of sort of variability, a lot of missing data. So I think you do have to be cautious in interpreting this data. And having been pulled in at the fairly last minute, a lot of this is, some of it's anecdotal, and we're looking at yearly change rather than the robust long-term trends. Starting off with the Cefas Celtic research cruise then, and most of the data on this was collected by one amazing volunteer, Pete Howlett, and thanks to Jerome van der Kooj from Cefas, who organised the trip for us. Bird numbers were reduced last year. In fact, it's the lowest total of the last 5 years. But there was a mixture of winners and losers across the survey. Firstly, the European storm petrel, it was the best year in the series. You can see, looking at the encounter rate there, it was far higher than any of the other previous 4 years. So averaging just under 30 birds per 100 kilometres of track line sampled. Although we did have a similar big count in 2017. Again, just under 900 birds seen. And that was also, at the same time, there's a lot of birds around. There's Atlantic depressions, which may have displaced a lot of birds from further offshore. But the result could be an effect of abundant food sources as well. One difference, though, is that in 2017, most of the birds were further east in Lyme Bay, off the Devon and Dorset coast, whereas last year, most of the birds were sort of southeast of the Scillies. Moving on to the gannet, a bird that struggled in recent years with bird flu. So it's good to see that numbers were far better than 2024, and the encounter rate was marginally the highest of the last 5 years, over 200 birds per 100 kilometres. And encouragingly, there's quite a few juvenile birds in there. So in the channel sampled areas, 10% of the birds were juveniles, but it's far less in the Celtic Sea and Western approaches, only 1.6%. And it's a big if, but if these were more local foraging birds, then that may suggest that the Alderney colony in the channel is recovering from bird flu to a greater extent than some of than the sort of big Welsh colony at Grasso. But as I say, that assumes that it's looking at sort of birds that haven't dispersed too far from breeding grounds. It was another good year for the large shearwaters. We're starting to take these scenes of Cories and great shearwaters for granted, but it took me, on small boat surveys, 22 years to see either of those two species. On the Cephas trip, it was the second highest year for great shearwater numbers in the series, nearly 2,000 birds counted. And interestingly, although the peak off the South Cornish coast that we heard about earlier was in September, the Celtic surveys show that these birds were lingering for another 6 weeks at least, 5-6 weeks at least, well into mid-late October in quantity. Not as many Cories shearwater, but again, if you look at the encounter rates in the little table at the bottom, you can see that this bird was only recorded for the first time on these trips in 2023. Moving on to the auks and some of the losers in this survey. So numbers of the auks were reduced last year, particularly the razorbill. So the numbers were just 15% of the previous 4-year average. And kittiwake seemed at a low ebb as well, the numbers. Let's just have a look at the encounter rates. So you can see here, kittiwake is really sort of struggle last year in particular. Guillemot encounter rate was half that of 2020. And yet, sorry, razorbill there, you can see it's at a really low ebb there compared to previous years. But I think one theme that we are seeing more and more of these sort of more extreme events and big immigrations and immigrations and emigrations of birds, over short time periods. If we'd have done the survey a month later, we might have picked up huge numbers of birds of all 3 species. In mid-November, for example, off Portland, they were getting 20,000 plus auks passing in a morning, and we were out at sea as well, and lots of those birds were feeding offshore, particularly razorbills. I think there's 20,000 kittiwakes as well off South Cornwall at the same time. So yeah, It is not necessarily a decline, just like a sort of just distribution shifts between months that may explain the reduced numbers in 2024. But as I say, it does highlight we're getting these extreme sort of periodic events now, mass movements of birds. It's a fairly obvious bird that is struggling in southwest waters. Only 29 great skuas counted on the whole survey. 10 years ago, you'd expect to see that many around a single trawl in some places. So it's by far and away the worst year in the series. And actually, across that whole programme of marine life surveys, we only saw one other bird, one other great skua. It used to be very common in Lyme Bay in the summer months. One bit of encouragement, though, is that 12% of the birds seen were juveniles. And so that's suggesting that there's sort of early signs of recovery from bird flu. Okay, the small boat surveys from Brixham, as I mentioned, they were decimated by bad weather. But so it was only one trip, but it was a pretty amazing one, actually. We had phenomenal numbers of Balearic shearwaters, or as is known, the Mediterranean shearwater now. Yeah, so nearly 2,000 birds. And that was suppressed eclipsed shortly after that trip by a count of nearly 2,000 off Berry Head. And, you know, there's obviously certainly several thousand birds were in Lyme Bay at the time, and most likely more than 10% of the global population. This was a big moment for me to see my first Wilson's petrel in Lyme Bay after 25 years looking for them. So, you know, it's pretty obvious difference there with the storm petrel on the left. And yeah, so we heard before, really interesting how this bird has exponentially increased as a seabird seen from the Cornish coast as well, and penetrating into Lyme Bay last year for the first time for us. We also do small boat trips from Portland Harbour out, so we get a chance to look at the seabird cliffs, take pictures of the colonies of guillemots and razorbills there. And kittiwake seems to have increased the last 2 or 3 years. It's far more nests on the cliffs than say 5 years ago, but we don't have any sort of productivity on that, but superficially that seems encouraging, although we've just heard it may not be, and it just could be a displacement of birds from other struggling colonies. Single puffin summered. Puffin's a really rare bird in Dorset, only regular places near Swanage, just a few pairs there. Amongst the guillemots, we do see bridles quite regularly. I think there's one or two, at least 2 birds in the cliffs breeding on the cliffs this summer. I think a lot of the birds that winter in Lyme Bay are Irish and Scottish birds, so perhaps not surprising that you get these events from time to time. Going further offshore from Portland into the Portland Deep and beyond, and into the eastern parts of Lyme Bay, it was a good year for storm petrels and Balearic shearwaters. And actually we saw some Arctic skuas as well for the first time in 3 years. Not many, but you know, a few birds is better than nothing. This picture perhaps shows a sign of the times that Arctic skua now is mainly sort of parasitizing Mediterranean gulls rather than what would be its quarry 10 years ago, like kittiwakes. Okay, moving on to the ferry surveys. So we have these 2 routes to Lundy from Bideford and Ilfracombe. And not a huge amount to say from the data, first impressions, but there seem to be more auks and kittiwakes than in 2024. And we also had this first sighting of a Corey shearwater as well on the 8th of August. First for us, not first for other people, that is. Onto the Channel Isles ferry, and the last 2 or 3 years there's been big flocks of molting Balearic shearwaters around the Channel Isles, and that we saw far fewer this year, although still good counts by any standards, over 100 on the 7th of September, but not the big numbers that we saw last year. We saw 1,750 on one day in August last year. The August trip this year, we didn't see any birds at all, which may indicate that the birds in Lyme Bay could have been the ones that have been summering off the Channel Isles in recent years. That was the scarce bird highlight, Sabine's gull in August on one of those routes. Okay, on to this new project. So this is a partnership with AK Wildlife Cruisers, some of the Exeter University students who are grouped together under the umbrella of Marine Watch. And we did 3 surveys during the winter months, looking within the special protection area at numbers of divers and grebes, and picking up decent numbers of Great Northern Diver. I think 36 were counted across the 3 surveys, and you can see they're very well distributed north of Falmouth in the inner bay there, but low numbers of the other qualifying SPA species, Slavonian grebe and black-throated diver. In fact, we didn't see any of the scarcer grebes, just one little grebe, and only one black-throated diver. Well, this is just starting this project, and more surveys are planned for 2026. So I think the interest in this came from doing a survey out of Lyme Regis about 3 years ago, and it seemed quite shocking at the time to see quite large rafts of Great Northern Divers in full breeding plumage singing. And I wasn't really expecting that, like 20, 30 birds in the sort of late winter, early spring period. And it just made you wonder whether this was partly a reflection of the conservation efforts in that area and the recovery of the reef. But there's not been a lot of winter surveys offshore, really. There's another interesting Great Northern Diver count by Mark Darlaston in this year, 2026, when just from the coast in the Torbay area, there's 226 counted, which is a phenomenal number and completely unprecedented for that area. So I think quite interesting things are going on in our wintering divers and grebes, but there's not really a lot of monitoring going on. We've got the aerial surveys of the SPA Falmouth, and some shore-based counts have been undertaken there. But I think a lot of the coastal counts, the birds are just too far away from the coast to pick up these birds. These Great Northern Divers off Lyme Regis are about 3-4 miles out in the sort of shallowish reef areas. So I think we're really keen to get more of these surveys underway for wintering important species. Onto the last program. This is a partnership with JNCC to bring in ESAS standard seabird recording on our ferries. So we've got routes in other parts of the UK. And so we did 6 surveys last year. Perhaps the best data was in October, which backed up the Cephas Celtic when we got good numbers of great shearwaters and storm petrels corroborating the Celtic survey. And something you don't see every day. This is a flock of 13 spotted redshanks. That was a bit of a wildcard observation, as well as a Leach's petrel on that trip, and a great skewer as well. I was chatting to the skipper on that trip, who seemed pretty knowledgeable on birds, and he said that was the first one he'd seen that year. Again, highlighting how scarce these birds are in our waters at the moment. So just onto the last slide then. This is just a picture of the Balearic shearwater from last year, the sightings scaled to abundance from our trips. And you can see the big concentration in Lyme Bay, Western Lyme Bay off the Brixham area, Brixham to start point, modest numbers off Portland, and then thin spread off the north coast of France in October and around the Channel Isles in the summer. It would be interesting, sorry I didn't get time to do it, but to overlay that with a slide, you know, the sightings from, say, 7 or 8 years ago. And I think there is a lot of variability in the data, but there's clearly like an eastward shift as well. And obviously we only cover the Western Channel, but birds are penetrating into the Eastern Channel in quantity now, so it's an active range distribution shift for this species. Just to finish off then, thanks to all the volunteers who took part in the surveys and are sort of sponsoring and collaborating bodies. I think particular Cephas for that amazing Celtic trip. And if anyone fancies getting out to sea, we're always interested to have more volunteers out on these boats. Okay, thank you.
No, thank you, Tom. It's great to hear that, and it's the first time for a long time we've had a really in-depth at sea presentation, and I think it just provides that really useful context to some of the observations that we're reporting regularly on land. So thank you very much for that. I hope you might become more of a regular fixture on these calls over the coming years. But yeah, definitely interested in that Balearic shearwater pattern. Certainly the work that I was involved with Tom and Tim Guilford a few years ago, patterns were looking very different to what Tom was finding last year. So really interesting stuff. Okay, we've got 2 more presentations to go. Next up is Paul St Pierre from RSPB and Simon Parker from Lundy Observatory and the Lundy Warden. So Paul, if you're there, are you first or Simon? I'm not sure which.
I think I'll go first, if that's okay. I think I think I'm right, Paul. I'll let you in a bit, but I'll just quickly go first. Let's see if I can take control. Seems to be working. Yes, here we go.
You're good.
So, okay, so a little bit about Lundy. So I'm quite new in position, which is why it's really useful to have Paul here as well. I've only been here since January, so talking about what happened on Lundy in 2025 is quite hard, but I've done a little bit of talking and looking at last year's data, but Paul will have more info on a lot of that stuff later. But so Lundy for me is my second island. I've just come across from Flatholme, which isn't too far away, sort of southwest. But Flatholme is a very different island, large gull colony. Lundy is, I guess, a much broader species base, lots of different seabirds, and very much in the recovery, whereas Flatholme's kind of in the decline, like a lot of gull colonies. It's suffering the same sort of fate of especially lesser blackbacks. But so we'll talk about Lundy today. So Lundy is owned by National Trust. It's run by the Landmark Trust, who kind of manage the island on their behalf, on their lease. Here it is, just in case anyone didn't know. Lundy Island is out on its own, really, off the coast of Devon. We're a very good location for migratory birds. It's quite often some of the first land they'll hit if they're coming across from the Atlantic. So it's quite a good island for rare birds, and it's why it's really helped us become an bird observatory, which has recently been fully accredited this year. So thanks a lot goes to my previous The previous warden, Joe Parker, did an amazing job, along with loads of help from people on the island and on the mainland, to get that through. So we're now a fully accredited bird observatory, which is amazing, and we're going to carry that work on. So there's Lundy out in the Bristol Channel. Some of the birds that it's home to. So as I said earlier, it's got a wide variety of seabirds. We do have, for my personal interest, the gulls are here as well, but in much smaller number, and they're really not doing very well. But overall, Lundy is a big success story. So if you came to the island sort of 20 years ago, population of seabirds here might be around 6,000 total seabirds. There were only about 4 or 5 puffins on the island, and now, as last count, Joe was counting 48,000 seabirds on the island, 1,300 puffins, 25,000 Manx shearwaters. It's pretty amazing, and that can pretty much be solely attributed to the eradication of rats, which was done. We were declared rat-free in 2006. So 20-year anniversary this year. So we'll be doing a little celebration on the island, which Paul will be involved with, I'm sure. And yeah, so we'll be doing that later in the year. Moving on. So a little bit about Lundy, a little bit more. That's where it sits. It's an SAC and a marine conservation zone. So Lundy's got an amazing marine base, which is why it is quite good for seabirds as well. But the marine area around Lundy has been protected for quite a long time now, and it houses a vast array of different marine life and habitats, and a lot of that's down to its unique geology. It's got strong tidal flows. It has a wide variety of different weather systems acting on it, and it's created a large variation in habitats, which has helped with the sea life. And now it has this protection in place as well. It's home to around 24 staff in the winter. It goes up to about 30 in the summer. So everyone here works for Landmark Trust, and Lundy kind of is a bit of a beast. Anyone who's been there will know it's a very popular island with tourists, and everyone here mucks in. So, I was up at 5:30 this morning making sure the generators were working. It's a very varied island, and everyone kind of has to muck in and do all kinds of things. But at the bottom there, you can see that we got the bird observatory in 2026. So you can see the seabird population, although it's doing well, there's definitely room for more. So we have space, and there's no reason why we can't have more. Historically, we've had more. So I think I would like to see the trend continue in some ways. I'd like to see the population continue to rise. And a lot of that will come down to keeping the island rat-free. So biosecurity is very tight here, and also supporting the recovery of some species through disturbance monitoring and things like that, especially because we get a lot of visitors here. Okay. So there has been a lot of change. So obviously I'm one of the big changes are the new warden, but there's also a change to the island management. With the bird observatory status as well, we've brought in Thomas Weston, who's a fantastic birder. He knows the island really well. He was here as a volunteer for a long time, and he's going to be doing a lot of the bird ringing and a lot of the census work as well, really supporting me massively. He's a big bonus for the island. But there is a lot of staff changes going on at the moment, and we're reorganizing how the conservation team works to manage the workload a bit better. So I will now I've always got Tara, who's really good with her marine knowledge, and Thomas will be taking care of a lot of the bird work as well. So I'm going to pass on to Paul now, if you want to carry on, Paul.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Paul St. Pierre, Conservation Officer for the RSPB, and I've worked on seabirds in the southwest for under 20 or 30 years now. So yeah, and I'm just going to update you on the survey work we carried out on Lundy in 2025 in conjunction with the Lundy wardening staff. Just before I say that, I mean, Lundy is an amazing story, and I think Tim Guilford sort of mentioned that he had just come back to do the Manx shearwater monitoring, and just the change that he noticed was thrilling. I would, if you want to lift your seabird soul and go somewhere where there's been a massive change, I would definitely recommend Lundy. It's an incredible turnaround, especially if you haven't been there for many years. You will be very, very surprised by what you see. So, yeah. But anyway, going back to the survey, so a group of about 4 volunteers and staff from the RSPB came out and joined the Lundy wardening staff, and we surveyed the cliff nesting seabirds between the 24th and the 30th of May. The species we covered were guillemot, razorbill, puffin, kittiwake, former, and shag. And we basically used the same methodology that we did with all the previous surveys. So this is just a repeat survey of surveys that have been carried out since about 1981. So there's an amazing series of records every 4 years. So really important data set. But it all follows the methodology set out in Walsh 1995. And all the data that we collect goes onto the JCC SMP or Seabird Monitoring Programme database. I think it's now the BTO one, so apologies for that. I should have updated it. And also sits on the Bird Observatory databases, so it's stored on Lundy as well, which is really important. And I'd also like to say it's great to see that Lundy has now become a bird observatory. I know that a lot of people put a lot of effort in to make that happen, and it's just meant there's a lot of effort going into monitoring not just the migrating birds, but there's clearly seabirds are important in there as well. So moving on. So just to give you an idea of the scale of the work we do. So this is Lundy, and basically we do vantage point surveys for the survey. So that means that we've broken Lundy down into 12 sections, and within those 12 sections there's over 120 viewpoints that we visit, and this enables us to view as much of the coastline as possible, particularly cliff and slope, but also to make sure it's safe. So we can't view everywhere, but we try and view as much as we can. So, and that's what we've been doing for the last since 1981. So a lot of work in a week. And just to let you know that we have about 50% of the breeding cliff nesting seabirds breed from Jenny's Cove North, which is sections E, F and G, north on the northwest side of Lundy. So we do those sectors twice, just so we can improve the monitoring the data set. So that's how we monitor. So going on to the seabirds now. So first of all, guillemot and razorbill. So the populations of guillemot and razorbill have increased dramatically since about 2004, 2005, and that's when rats, black and brown rats, were cleared off the islands. Prior to that, during the survey period in the early 80s, population was pretty stable. It basically just bobbed up and down a little bit, really. But in 2025, we counted something like 12,000 guillemot, and that compares to something like 2,300 in 2004. So there's been a huge increase in numbers there. But as already mentioned by Simon, the population was much higher in 1939. Perry counted about 19,000 guillemots. So clearly lots of space still available. And the same story with razorbill. Our population we counted 2025 was 4,500 odd birds. And that's compared to just 840 in 2004. So again, a significant increase, lots more space. I think it's worth noting that Lundy is now not nationally but internationally important for razorbill. So it supports over 1% of the UK population of breeding razorbill now. So that's a really important and significant milestone for the islands. Moving on to puffin, I think Simon stole my thunder a little bit, but so population, our survey, we've got about 1,300 puffin in 2025. Again, Perry found about 3,500 in 1939, so we clearly sort of double that population at least still, so plenty of space for puffin. And reflecting back, only 5 were left in 2004. and this was one species identified as a potential beneficiary from rat removal, and clearly the population has increased significantly since. So that's an incredible story, and very important for Lundy as well. Other species, the next one is kittiwake. So again, nationally, the picture for kittiwake is quite depressing. The numbers are declining in lots of colonies. However, on Lundy, the population declined from 1981 to 2013, but has increased since. And that increase continued in 2025, and now the population is above the pre-2000 level, and we counted something like 450 birds, apparently occupied nests on Lundy, which makes it a really important colony. And again, as alluded to by the speakers, we don't know whether this is birds just relocating from colonies that have been abandoned and been attracted to a colony that's just hanging on and slightly healthier, or whether it's birds finding access to healthy food sources in the Celtic Sea just because of the geography of the location of Lundy. Moving on next to Fulmer. The population of Fulmer's fluctuated pretty much since the early 80s. Population has increased slightly. It's lower this year than the previous count in 2021, so it's about 218 apparently occupied nests, which is still quite high considering the population over all those years. But we don't know whether that decline is going to start reflecting what's happening elsewhere. I would say that with the counts that we do, it's quite hard to get an accurate count of apparently occupied nests because there's quite a lot of Fulmer that could be sitting but not breeding. And that's a situation where, unless you do productivity counts over a period of time, you'll find out. So that does mean that we don't necessarily pick up all the birds that we pick up are breeding necessarily or successfully breeding. Moving on to shag. Again, the population of shag have increased quite a lot over the period of the years. The population is about 118, which is the highest it's ever been, I think, on the islands in the period of this monitoring. It's interesting to note that the last peak in 2020, it was about 2013, 2012, 2013, I think it was just prior to the big stormy winter that we had in 2013-14, which we think may have been the cause of population decline then. So as mentioned in Scilly, it will be interesting to see with the next survey whether the population significantly declines off the back of the winter we've just had this year. So yeah, positive at the moment for shag, but we think that the weather this winter might have an impact looking forward. Just bear in mind that with the shag monitoring, we do it quite late in the season for shag. It's not the optimal time, so you have to be a bit cautious with the figures that we present because we might be undercounting. We might have missed a few nests. And so moving on. So this gives you an idea of the change in the status of Lundy overall in its seabird assemblage. So as Simon mentioned, we've got over 45,000 seabirds now breeding on Lundy, and 20,000 of those are the cliff nesting seabirds. So that's a massive change compared to the 6,000 odd that was prior to sort of 2000 and back to the 80s. So a huge change in the population size. And in fact, Lundy's now probably the third largest site for cliff nesting seabirds in England. So it's only Flamborough Head and Northumberland Coast are larger. So a really important change in its status and really important for England now. So having a summary and looking forward. So yeah, a huge number of seabirds, the largest since 1930s, over 25,000 in Manx shearwater, but the cliff nesting seabirds are really important as well. As Simon mentioned, biosecurity is critical to sustaining that population and maintaining and protecting it. The seabird colony itself, both Manx shearwater and Rosebill now make the site internationally important for seabirds. It would be fantastic if they could be designated as SPA. Currently, the population of some of the seabirds are protected through the SSSI designation on land, but they don't get the same sort of protection that places like the Isles and Scilly would get and their seabirds at sea. So it would be fantastic to improve that level of protection. And just to say that we'll continue to carry out the monitoring of seabirds on a 4-yearly cycle. the next seabirds we're doing this year are gulls, the large gulls, and then following on from that will be Manx shearwater and storm petrel again. And just to mention that shag and gull colouring will be carried out or planned to be carried out this year by the Lundy team, and I think Tim is maybe going out again to do Manx shearwaters on Lundy. You might correct me if I'm wrong, to do some tracking work, and storm petrel is also planned to be tracked by the RSPB from Lundy again this summer. So exciting times for seabirds on Lundy. And that's me. So I'll pass you back to
back to
Alex.
me, I think, Paul. Yeah, thank you. Always great to hear about what's happening, and yeah, glad to see those trends continuing. It's fantastic, really, as you say, the changes that we've seen in a relatively short space of time. So thanks for hanging in there, everybody. We're nearly there. There's just a few slides left for me to finish the roundup around Devon and Dorset, but I will be quick, I promise. So we've got a handful of sites on the south coast of Devon, just which I will briefly tell you about. So one of them is my local colony that I monitor with my friend Ruth Porter. Thanks to Ruth for making these slides. This is a small kittiwake colony. As you can see, last year we had 190 apparently occupied nests, which is fairly typical across the period that we've been monitoring this site. So this will be the 9th year that we've been watching the site. As you can see, in 2023 there was a bit of a dip. That was probably related to avian influenza, so it's good to see things have bounced back. Productivity, as in common with the other kittiwake colonies we've heard about, is not great, but it was actually slightly better last year than it has been most of this decade. What we tend to see now is that it's only really the very seaward end of the colony that really fledge any chicks, and the part of the colony closest to shore, which has much flatter, broader ledges, normally always cleaned out before any chicks have any chance to hatch whatsoever. So we think this is probably avian predation. We haven't got much monitoring to be able to confirm that, but it seems very likely. We have seen ravens and things like that hanging around the colony, in common with what Mark was reporting from Cornwall. So it's a difficult problem to solve, but it definitely seems to be keeping productivity quite low for kittiwakes in the southwest. In contrast, the guillemot colony, at Berry Head in Tor Bay is pretty stable. It looked like a bit of a dip in 2025. Actually, this is probably a result of the way that the counts are averaged across the count period, because the last of those counts was done quite late in the season, or actually I think the birds had left the cliffs earlier in the season. So not sure there's anything to worry about yet at this site. Obviously, we'll see how things look in 2026. This is a good example of a couple of sites on the South Devon coast that Mark referred to, smaller sites that are monitored regularly, and they just give us a really interesting, different angle on what's happening. So they're not big seabird colonies; they're very small ones effectively, but we do get regular data for these sites, and they look relatively stable. These figures of 8 and 18 respectively for those two parts of the South Devon coast are very similar to what we've received in the last 3 or 4 years, but it just enables us to see what's happening at some of the more suboptimal breeding locations, as well as the big colonies like Lundy and the Scillies. So yeah, definitely encouraging people to collect data when you're out and about on the coast. The National Trust have started collecting some data at the Mewstone. So this is the kind of rocky outcrop just around the corner from Plymouth Sound. It's very interesting because they counted the side of the rock that you can see in the picture. The last time it was monitored was by me and a couple of colleagues, and we went around the back of the rock on a boat, and we got much smaller numbers of cormorant and shag than were recorded from the landward side. So it just goes to show we need to think about monitoring in the round for these sites. But anyway, relatively healthy numbers for this small shag and cormorant colony. And then finishing up with Dorset, we didn't get any data yet from Brownsea Island. So if there's anyone on the call who has contacts in Dorset or through Dorset Wildlife Trust, it'd be great if we could get any breeding data from Brownsea Island, which is one of the bigger colonies within this region. But we have got data from Bull Harbour, Purbeck Cliffs, Lobmore, Chesil Beach and Abbotsbury, which I'll very briefly summarise. So there are some low-lying flat islands in Poole Harbour that host Mediterranean gulls and black-headed gulls. As you can see from this plot, which is for black-headed gulls, numbers have been decreasing and continue to decrease over the 15 or 20-year period for which we've got data. I think the main issue is that the islands frequently overtop. That could be related to things like sea level rise. It's obviously a difficult problem to try and address because there have been controls on things like egg collection from these sites designed to increase productivity of the birds and help numbers to recover. But so far, it doesn't look like that's having an effect. Thanks to Footprint Ecology, who monitor the Purbeck Cliffs with Delston Country Park and National Trust, we have this great series of long-running data which goes all the way back to the 60s. What you can see, the blue line, the pale blue line, is guillemot. It gets its own axis because the numbers of guillemot are so much greater than everything else. And in common with other sites around the southwest, we've seen this gradual, well, quite steep increase in recent years in guillemot numbers. It's starting to wobble around a bit now, but you can clearly see that trend over time is increasing. We don't have productivity data as far as I'm aware, so we don't know whether this is a site a bit like Ryan was describing in Cornwall that's doing really well for abundance with some issues of productivity underneath. But certainly for now, abundances continue to increase, and the same story for razorbill on a lower order of magnitude. Somewhere buried in here is puffin, for which there are 3 pairs and 0 productivity. Some people may have seen my friend and former colleague Richard Caldo on Springwatch recently talking about the challenges with the Purbeck Cliffs and the puffin population there. And Richard is involved in thinking of ways to try and increase productivity on that part of the coast. And I'm trying to persuade him to come and tell us about it maybe next year. So that would be really interesting. A couple of other tern colonies at Lobmore, which is an RSPB site, and then further along at Abbotsbury. Both of these have kind of bounced back a bit from a bit of a hit they took during the avian influenza years. You can see numbers of common tern here increased in 2025. Productivity where it was recorded was pretty good at Abbotsbury, about 2 chicks per pair, which is back to what it was before avian influenza really hit that colony. So things are looking relatively back to normal, I would say, at those tern and black-headed gull sites. And another success story, which is always great to see, little terns at Chesil continuing to increase. So this site has been the subject of very intense conservation effort from RSPB over the years, and you can see it's really borne fruit. So it's the only little tern colony we have in the southwest. It's still not a huge colony, about 50 pairs, but as you can see, we're now seeing that kind of sustained increase over time. And it's a great example of how dedicated conservation action can bring about recovery. It's also a great example of how the local community can get involved in projects because there's wardening effectively 24/7. And that includes local people, including one of my friend's sons, who is just getting into conservation and joined the volunteering team last summer. So fantastic for people and fantastic for nature. Productivity is obviously slightly more up and down as it usually is, but a decent estimate of 39 fledglings from 2025 is helping to support that population's recovery. Lower than 2024, but obviously compares well with some of the years in the early days when productivity was effectively 0. So that completes that very whistle-stop tour of the other part of Devon and Dorset. Just to reiterate Mark's point about monitoring, if you go onto the Seabird Monitoring Programme website, you can see all of the vacant sites around the southwest. You can volunteer to collect data at those. You can visit them a handful of times over the summer. You can go for a nice walk on the cliff top and combine that with a bit of bird watching, and that will contribute really valuable data that we can also use within the Southwest Marine Ecosystem reporting. So yeah, definitely recommend people get involved wherever you can and wherever you can spare the time. So I want to say thank you very much to everybody for hanging in there for the 2 hours and listening to these presentations. It takes time for people to make presentations, to give their time up to present. So I want to give a massive thank you to all of our speakers. It was really a fascinating set of talks. Really, really enjoyed it. I hope you did too. Thank you also massively to RSPB, who helped to organise the webinar and host it for us today. Everything ran smoothly, so thank you to Ellie for setting all of that up for us. I will close the webinar now. Please do send me any observations or any notes you might have from 2025 that we can include in the annual report. And if not, I will hopefully see you next year on next year's webinar. Bye, everybody.